All right, whenever you're ready, Kole, you're good to go.
Okay. Are the attendees on?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Sorry, I just didn't see on my end. Well, hi everyone. Happy Saturday and welcome back. I have, per usual, a nice and fun class planned for you today. So I've been wanting to do this one for a while, and I feel like since DC is just below Maryland, crab cakes are like something that I would be like ashamed not to do. And I am by no means a crab cake master, but right around Valentine's Day at Safeway, there was a sale for lump crab. And if you've ever made crab cakes before, getting real crab is kind of like a costly thing. And so when I see something that has a sale on it, especially if it's more of like a high end item, I love to go out and experiment and play with it. And so that's what we're doing today. So if you ever wanted to try to make crab cakes, I believe the sale goes on till I think it's the 24th. This isn't sponsored or anything. I really love crab. And since moving to DC, I've got to experience really fantastic crab cakes. And so I thought I would do my version of a crab cake that is sort of like an homage to the Maryland crab cake. So today we're making Kole's version of crab cakes. And then to accompany that, we're also doing something I call crispy green bean fries, which are just a little bit of a twist on green beans where they're extra crispy and crunchy. And I think they pair really well with the crab cake. And then we're gonna top that off with something called a remoulade sauce. And that's really just a fancy word for tartar sauce. And we're gonna make all of those today, hopefully within the hour. And hopefully they turn out good. This is a live show, fingers crossed, and we'll have a lot of fun. Per usual, some housekeeping things that are going on in the kitchen today. I just have one skillet on my stove today. I'm just using that. And also my oven is preheated to 400 degrees. And if you're new to these classes, welcome. There's another camera, if you can see, where you can look at how I'm prepping ingredients on the surface here. So if you're ever sort of curious on what's going more in depth on my counter, if you look at that one screen, you can pin it and get a better look on what I'm doing. Also, if you have questions, absolutely feel free to type those into the comments, and Jessica is going to relay those to me as soon as she can, and I'll try my best to answer those. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. The thing that takes the longest in terms of baking time is going to be the green bean fries. So what we want to do is begin to prep working with those. And I have over here just a single egg, and we want to start to make a drudge. And a drudge is essentially a combination of some sort of binder, and usually an egg is used. Sometimes you can use oil, and that's an option, but I find it sticks a little bit better with an egg. And so we're just looking to scramble the egg essentially in this glass. I'm just using a fork. You can use a whisk if you'd like. We want to make sure the yolk and the egg white is, for the most part, decently combined. I'm pretty happy with that. If you get too large of chunks, if it's not fully whisked up, some of those chunks can stick to your green beans, and that's just something that we want to avoid. So I want to make sure that there's no big chunks of egg in here. I think I'm pretty good with that. So what I'll do now, believe it or not, is I have a plate here, and I'm actually just going to pour the scrambled egg onto the plate. I'll shift this around just a bit. And then I have here, on this plate, there is a 1/3 cup of panko breadcrumbs, which is a kind of Japanese breadcrumb. It's extra like crunchy and the texture is fantastic. And then also on here, I have a 1/3 cup of just regular old Parmesan. So nothing too crazy. And then in this, what we're going to add, I'm gonna make sure that I get the measurements correct. I wrote it down over here. It is a 1/4 teaspoon of black pepper, a 1/4 teaspoon of garlic powder, a 1/2 teaspoon and a 1/2 teaspoon of Old Bay. And so I'm going to go ahead and just pour this in. Set this off to the side, and I'm giving it a light mix. So I want to incorporate all of those spices and make sure that the Parmesan and panko is mixed in fairly evenly. I think that looks fairly good. So now we're going to go ahead and cut up our green beans, and really any kind of green beans will do. But the French green beans I find are a little bit longer. They're also, oh my goodness. I'm so sorry. One moment. I'm not sure what's happening. Jessica, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
I'm sorry, I don't know. I was like getting it said on my computer that I was getting a spam call.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, classic. That's always how it goes, right? So I apologize for that, everyone. But you can use any green bean. French green beans are typically thinner and they're also historically longer, but any will do. And so what I'm doing right now is I'm just lining some up. And usually with green beans, there are these little stems on the end. I'll show you on this camera here. And so we want to chop off those. And if they're overly thin, they're going to get really crispy. And so I'm going to try to avoid that and just pick some that are a bit thicker. And then with my knife here, go ahead and just chop off about the last ½ inch or so on both ends. And we're just going to discard those. I'll do the same thing on the other side. Sometimes they like to shift around. That's normal. And we'll start with this. So whenever you go to drudge something, which is when you go to coat it again in liquid and then cover that in something like panko or Parmesan like we're using today, usually what you want to do is you want to have a designated wet hand and a designated dry hand. And so what I have here, hopefully you can see okay. So I have my green beans on my cutting board, and I'm going to grab, for me, I find it works best if I use like 3 or 4 at a time. If you do a little bit more than that, they have a tendency to sort of clump together. And so I want to avoid that. So this is, my left hand's going to be my designated wet hand. That's going to be sort of covered in egg. So I'm going to just really lightly coat them. It doesn't need to be overly saturated. As long as it's like wet in some capacity, it'll be fine. And then I'll go ahead and take these green beans and I'll set them in, and my right hand is going to be my designated dry hand. And what I'm doing is I'm just taking some of the panko and Parmesan and spices, covering it over the top, and just doing a gentle pat. And what you're left with are these green beans that are just beautifully coated and crispy in the panko and Parmesan and those spices. So what's nice about using Parmesan in this is, since it's a cheese, it's going to get a little bit melty, and it's also going to, because it's a low moisture cheese, really aid to the crispiness that is going to be on these green beans. So normally I would do this over the period of about, I'd say 5 minutes or so. So it takes a little bit of time because you kind of got to work in batches. But I think potentially this is something you could do ahead of time. Like if you knew that you wanted to make this for a dinner, you could do this, I would say, 4 to 5 hours ahead of time and just go ahead and plop it in the fridge. And that way, whenever your guests come over, all you have to do is set this in the oven and you're good. So I just have a baking sheet here that's lined with parchment paper. You shouldn't need to grease it at all. It should be fine. The one piece of advice I will say is that you want to make sure that you don't over cram your green beans onto the tray. So if I were to do this whole package here, that most likely is going to eat up a lot of space, and there's not going to be, I would say, too many gaps around the green beans. And so if any, and this is actually true for any vegetable that you're baking in the oven, If they're too close together and you're wanting them to get crispy, what instead will happen is they actually steam instead of getting that nice crispy texture and sometimes that flavor that you get too when things get crispy. And that's because the moisture from the green beans, because they're so close and crammed in together, it creates this sort of like steaming effect rather than the crispiness that you think would just naturally come from putting something in the oven. So if they're too close together, they're not going to get overly crispy. So I'll do these last few bits. And it is fairly relaxing too. It's really simple. It's kind of a mindless chore, but you can see, I mean, gosh, that's just fantastic. There's so much breadcrumbs on there. Okay, I think we'll be good with that. I don't need to do all these with you. So I'm gonna rinse off my hands quick. Right. So these are basically done. The only thing we have left to do is let them hang out in the oven. Again, it's preheated to 400 degrees, and I'm just gonna set this in the center of the tray and let it hang out for about 30 minutes. All right, the timer is set. I feel good about this. I'm gonna set these off to the side. So that wasn't terribly complicated, and they're gonna be so delicious and fantastic. I can't wait for you to see them. The next thing that we're gonna do is get started on our crab cakes. And these are like really simple too. I think when I go out to a restaurant or I see them pre-made at the grocery store, in my mind, I always thought they were like pretty complicated, but really it's not necessarily a difficult thing to manage. It's just the crab just gets overly expensive sometimes. So if you see a sale, I highly recommend you give it a try. So the main component to crab cakes are sort of two stages. You need two bowls, like I have here, and one is going to be designated for the crab and panko, and then the other is going to be designated for your wet ingredients. And I'll tell you why you want to separate those for the most part, and then combine them a little bit later. So first things first, we're going to go ahead and get the crab. And so I have this one stored just in a plastic bag in the fridge. I'm going to set this in this bowl here. Cool. Smells fantastic. And then next, what I want to do is begin to pour in my panko. So the amount of crab that I used is a ½ pound, so 8 ounces. And then to this, I have, just let me double check. This is a ½ cup of panko. Again, that same Japanese breadcrumb. It goes there. You'll want to grab a spatula. And the trick here is if you're overly aggressive with the crab, what's going to happen is you're going to break up those lumps and it's going to get overly flaky. And so we're trying our best to avoid that. And one of the techniques that we're going to be utilizing a lot for these crab cakes is something called folding. And folding is really simple. All you have to do is grab a spatula. And if you can take a peek on this camera here, I'm just sliding it down the edge of my container, or my bowl in this case, and then scooping it up from the bottom and just sort of lifting and folding it over itself. And so you do this a few times and really you're good. So this is absolutely fine. I'm cool with this. So this step is done. Now the next step that we want to do is focus on the wet ingredients and the spices. We want to get everything really incorporated here. So I think first things first, what we want to do is add in our mayo. And since this is all going to be used by the same spatula, I'm just going to scrape this off and use this one. This mayo, I'm using just a 1/4 cup of regular old mayo. And to this, we're gonna go ahead and add in 1 egg. The egg is gonna be our binder in this situation. It's gonna hold everything together. So there's that. And then we want to add in a half teaspoon of anchovy paste. And this isn't necessarily a normal ingredient for crab cakes. A lot of times what is added instead is Worcestershire sauce. And fun fact about Worcestershire is the main flavor component in Worcestershire is anchovy. So you don't necessarily need to go out and buy anchovy paste, but I really wanted an authentic, really robust flavor. And so I thought I'm just going to use this. If you don't necessarily want to go out and get anchovy paste, that's totally fine. You can just substitute for a half teaspoon of Worcestershire. But I think the flavor profile of this is going to be really well balanced and delicious. So to this, we also need mustard. And so I believe this calls for 1 teaspoon. You can use Dijon. I'm using this thick grain, both work. And then spice-wise with this, I got a little bit more of like an Asian influence going on. So I have here some Gochujang, which is it's a kind of fermented soybean paste that has like these really fantastic spice components to it. I really like it. And there's also this umami flavor that I really enjoy. I'm also using a chili garlic sauce and then also just a little bit of red curry paste. So all of these things are optional that I have that I just mentioned. You don't necessarily have to do this. Most recipes call for like basically a teaspoon or 2 of a hot sauce of your preference. And so for me, I really like umami as a flavor component. I wanted to accentuate that in these crab cakes. And so that's why I'm using these. If you don't necessarily want to go out and like get these ingredients, again, totally fine. Just go ahead and use whatever sort of hot sauce that you enjoy. I would say start off with a teaspoon and then sort of, waft it, see if that is a smell that you think you could like. And if you want more heat, just add in 1 more, but I probably wouldn't do more than 2 teaspoons. So that goes in there. Toss this. And then we also have, just let me double check, 1 teaspoon of Old Bay. That is very much an important ingredient in crab cakes. And then I think that's everything, just looking at my ingredients list. Oh, actually 1 more thing, and it's actually fairly important, is we're going to use the zest of a lemon because we want to brighten up these flavors a whole lot. So what I'll do is just grab my zester, also referred to as a microplane. And most of those really bright lemony flavors that lemon provides, the zest is great for doing that because the aromatic components are in that zest. And though lemon juice, obviously tastes like lemon, we don't want to add too much of that sharp acidity. Instead, we just want the flavor and the aromatics of the lemon without, making it overly sour. It takes just a little bit of time. But one thing you want to do whenever zesting is just underneath the color, that really bright yellow color is the pith, the white part of the lemon. And if you get too much of that, the white part, that kind of makes it overly bitter. So try your best to very lightly and mindfully zest the lemon. Cool. I'm pretty good with that. It's a decent chunk of lemon zest. I'm going to use a little bit of it too for the remoulade sauce. Right. So there is the zest. And one thing I want to do right now is I'm going to make sure my skillet is starting to preheat, and I'm going to add some oil to it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to eyeball about, I would say, a tablespoon or 2 of a high heat oil. I'm using an avocado oil. And so I'm going to go ahead and pour that onto my skillet. And really, you just want enough so that the surface of the skillet is coated in oil. And I'm going to take the heat of that to like a medium heat. And if you can hear, Jessica, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Do you hear any like turbulence going on right now?
Yes.
Okay, so my upstairs roommate, or not roommate, but like housemate,
Neighbor.
yeah, is deciding to vacuum. So this is just going to be one of those.
It's an adventurous day.
It is an adventurous day.
There we
That
go.
is true. Can't make this stuff up. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is mix all this stuff together and try to incorporate it. We want it to be pretty darn smooth. And what will happen if you take a peek at this camera is it's going to start to change to a really fantastic reddish color. And that's from the gochujang, the red curry paste, and also some of that chili garlic sauce. So again, as a reminder, my skillet is on medium heat. I have about 2 teaspoons of a high heat oil. If you don't use avocado oil, you can use grapeseed oil, canola oil, anything like that will do. I just want to make sure that I'm breaking everything up for the most part. Sometimes the chili paste is a little bit thick. And so I'll show you, this is what it looks like so far. So because the crab and the panko are sort of coating each other, now that we add in this liquid component, hopefully it's going to be really easy to fold in. I'm just taking my spoon from the bottom because we want as large of chunks of crab as possible in these crab cakes. And if it seems overly watery, like as you're going to mix all of this together, if you're finding that the crab isn't necessarily clumping together and it's more sort of just like falling apart, what you can do is just sprinkle in a little bit more panko and it should fix that.
And Kole, we do have a question. Deborah wants to know how much of the Asian seasoning you add.
Oh yes, sorry, I didn't explain or relay that. So I used a teaspoon of gochujang, a teaspoon of chili garlic sauce, and a 4th teaspoon of red curry paste.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have just right here some wax paper, and this recipe will ultimately make you 4 crab cakes. And so what I want to do with this right now is just start to spread it out in the bottom of my bowl without, again, breaking up too much of the lumps that we want to keep intact. And then I'm just going to, with the tip of my spatula, quarter this off into 4 sections. And those are essentially going to be the segments that I'm going to use to form my crab cakes. Before I do that, I want to check my green beans because I smell them and they almost smell like very crispy. So let's see. Well, they're looking great. So it says on my end that there's 17 minutes left, but because I didn't use this whole bag, I'm assuming I'm going to have a less bake time. So they're probably going to be done in, I would say, like 5 minutes. So that's exciting. So what I'm going to do with these crab cakes, since I quartered them off into sections, I'm going to go ahead and grab one. And really, we're just forming them into patties. And it's nothing too complicated. They're a little watery. It would have been fine to add a little bit more panko, but I think we'll be okay. Because a chunk of the wateriness, you have to remember, is going to come from the egg, and that egg is going to firm up just like eggs do. So I think this will be fine. If it isn't falling apart too much on this form, I think we'll be okay. And so just for convenience sake, I think we'll do just 2 crab cakes for right now, and I'll do the rest of these later. And I'm gonna adjust my heat just a little bit. And this next step I guess is technically optional. You don't necessarily need to fry these on a skillet, but I find that I really like the browning effect that comes from the crab cakes. Like when you go to crisp them on both sides. So have this again, the skillet's on medium heat. I'm gonna grab one of my crab cakes and set it kind of on the outer edge where the oil is. And one thing ideally you want to hear that I'm not hearing is a sizzle. So as soon as you put your crab cake on, ideally you would hear some sort of like crisping. And because I'm not hearing that, I'm adjusting my heat to just a little bit past medium heat. And then once that starts to sizzle, that's when I'm going to add my next one. So what this tells me now, because this one wasn't quite sizzling right away, is that I need to leave that one on just a little bit longer and also pay just a bit of attention to it to make sure that it browns appropriately and forms that crust. So what we're going for is just sort of like a light golden brown crust. And you don't want it to be like overly charged, just something that sort of has some, like a nice color to it. So for me, I found that once you set this on the skillet and there is a sizzle, that basically it's about 2 minutes per side of the crab cake. So 2 minutes on one side, flip it, 2 minutes on the other. And then just to make sure everything is cooked really evenly through, I'm gonna pop these in the oven for about 10 minutes once both sides are crisped up.
Cole, Roger is asking if you can use extra virgin olive oil instead of avocado oil.
My only hesitancy with that is extra virgin. It has a fairly low smoke point. And so because we want some color on these crab cakes, that the temperature is going to be a little bit high. I think technically you can, and it's safe, but I would say if you heat up the oil and to the temperature that you're looking for, and you see it smoking, that's how you know it's too high. So everyone's stove and range is a little bit different. I think that it could be fine. And one thing that I actually like to do is if you want some of those flavors from the olive oil, I would say do like a tablespoon of olive oil and then add in a tablespoon of butter. And those flavors are going to like really be fantastically incorporated. I did a crab cake version when I was trialing this recipe with that specific oil combination, and it turned out really well. But I just thought for today, for convenience sake, it's a step that you don't necessarily need to do. So I think technically you can do it, but maybe if you're curious, you can add in a little bit of butter, and that's going to help create just a higher threshold of heat. All right, so I'm going to rinse off my hands. They're covered in crab and egg. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and give that first one a check. We want to make sure that there's some browning underneath it. It looks great. And go ahead and flip it. We'll see the second one. Get it. They look really good. Cool. So if you saw, I adjusted the heat just a little bit more. And now I have a gut feeling that the green beans are done. And they are. They look really good. So I'll show you on this end. I'll go ahead and plate them in just a moment. Can you guys see that okay? I hope so. So some of those bubbling, that is the Parmesan crisping up. And then the panko is also nice and brown and crispy too. So our last step that we have to do is just go ahead and make our remoulade sauce. And that is fairly simple. Again, it's just a tartar sauce, so nothing really too crazy at all. And one ingredient that I'm really excited to share with you is a kind of Japanese mayo. There's lots of Asian influence today, which I didn't actually plan out or plan ahead. It's just a happy coincidence. But it's a brand of mayo called Kewpie. It's spelled Kewpie. And what's special about this specific kind of mayo is it's made from almost like exclusively eggs. And the quality of it and the flavor is, I mean, not like I'm some connoisseur of mayo, but this is like, if you're looking to really elevate and make a fancy tartar sauce or remoulade, this is something I would say that you might want to consider investing in. It's a little bit more expensive than traditional mayo, but the flavor is just like top notch. So I'm going to add in a half cup of the Kewpie mayo. It's a little bit more viscous than traditional mayo. I think I need to double check my crab cakes. I hear them really sizzling. Not too bad. Give them one more flip. There we go. All right. Turn it down just a bit. So before I get going on this, I actually need to tend to these crab cakes. So here, I just have like a small baking tray that I've lined with tin foil. I'm going to go ahead and transfer the crab cakes to my baking tray. Cut the heat to my burner. So, but I'll show you before they go in the oven. This is how they look right now. So we have some decent browning. The other side is a little bit less brown. It's more on the golden side, which is fine. But I'm gonna let these hang out in the oven, again, at 400 degrees for about 10 minutes, because I want them to be heated all the way through. I think potentially you could serve them right now. I think the temperature should be consistent and fine. Just you might want to double check with a meat thermometer. Because there's so much moisture in here, I just want to be extra sure. And so I think putting them in the oven is a smart move. All right, timer is started for 10 minutes. And as that is hanging out, we're going to go ahead and make our remoulade. So again, there was a half cup of a Kewpie brand mayo that went into here. And then also with this, we're going to add the zest of about half a lemon, and I have a little bit more zest left on this lemon here, so I'm just going to use the rest of that. We want those really bright citrus flavors. And again, we're trying not to have too much pith, that white part in it. We don't want it to be bitter at all. There's also different gauges of zesters. So the category that this falls in is something called a microplane. And you can choose how fine your zest is essentially by how large these holes are on the microplane. And really, they get like pretty extensive, and some people are like very specific about the kind of zester, but really any standards plane will do. So let me get this little bit. It smells so good. I think that's one thing that you can always sort of default to if a recipe calls for any sort of citrus. If you want a bit more of those really brightening components of flavor, just a small amount of zest, it changes the game. It's delicious. All right. So we have the zest of half a lemon. We're also going to use the juice of half a lemon. So I'll just use the same lemon here.
Cole, can I interrupt you real quick?
Absolutely, yeah.
We have a question. Is it possible to bake the crab cakes instead of frying them?
Yes, yep. So I personally just like the crisp edges on both sides. So if you choose not to do that, that's totally fine. I think if you were to bake it at 400 for like 15 to 20 minutes, that should be appropriate. Off the top of my head, I don't know exactly what the internal temperature should be, but what I can do is send you a follow-up email. So that way, when you send out the full recipe, we can make sure everything's all square.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. All right. So we have the juice of half a lemon, the zest of half a lemon, half a cup of mayo. I'm going to rinse off my hands. They're very lemony.
And will this sauce keep in the fridge for a day or so?
Absolutely, yeah. So it can last for up to 2 weeks. And I think that's a good chunk of time, especially with all the flavors going on in here. All right, so there is some anchovy paste in here. There's about a teaspoon. So I'm going to use that. And again, you don't necessarily need to use anchovy paste. If you want to, you can default to the Worcestershire sauce. But I really like the flavor of it. I would never eat anchovy paste just like straight out of the tube. I think that'd be weird, but the flavor it adds is, I mean, you can't deny it. It's so good. Also, we're gonna add in some mustard. So a teaspoon in here as well. I'm using the mustard side of this. Dijon, whichever. Even like a spicy mustard, I think would be really good. And then we also need some Old Bay. I'm gonna do a 4th teaspoon. Let's see, where do they put that? Here we go. All right, and so I think that's it for the spices, just double checking. Salt and pepper to taste, so maybe I'll do that now. And I think like an 1/8 to a 4th teaspoon of both is fine. And I'm actually gonna hold off on the salt. I don't necessarily think this recipe needs salt, but if you want to add some, you totally can. I just personally think it's fine without it. So to this, we're also going to add in some green onion, also referred to as scallion. And so they usually have these sort of funky roots at the ends. We want to remove those. So chop off that bottom 1/2 inch or so. And we don't want too thick of green onion. We don't want large chunks of it. So what I'm going to do, if I set this off to the side here, is where the white parts are, I'm actually going to make a slit down the center of it so that it forms like this V shape, right? But I'm going to keep that together, and I'll do that to all 3. And go ahead and line them up. And we want these slices to be really as thin as you can. So this is where those knife skills come in handy. And because we made that initial slit, half the size they would regularly be. And I'm going to stop once I start to get to that green gradient where the internal of the white part of the green onion or the scallion has green in it. So I'm going to stop there because the white is what has that really fantastic flavor. And just discard the rest. Also in this, we're going to add something called a Cornichon, or also referred to as a gherkin. And these are just like those classic tiny pickles. They're like the most adorable thing on the planet. In the recipe, I have it for a 4th cup of Cornichons. You don't have to go that crazy. Just kind of eyeball it to whatever you prefer. What I'm doing, similarly to those green onions, is I'm just going to go ahead and cut them down the center. And then line them up and give them a fairly fine chop. So I think the smaller chunks, the better. But if you like it thicker and chunkier, that works too. And I'm actually good with that, honestly. Because the next part is my favorite ingredient. I use these all the time. Capers add the salty component for me to this remoulade, which is why I don't necessarily think it needs extra salt. But also, since I really like capers, I'm going to add in a lot of capers. The recipe calls for about a tablespoon. But if you want to use more, absolutely feel free. But I want these to have a bit of a chop too. But the brininess to them is so good. It's like an olive, but it's different. And it's not quite a pickle either. It's like this strange hybrid of flavor. Now, if you wanted to, I did write this in the recipe. I think what's nice about capers is you can toast them a little bit, just like on a skillet on just under medium heat. And there is this really interesting, fantastic flavor that occurs when you do that. It's not a necessary step, and I'm not going to do it today just for convenience sake. But if you wanted to, I think that would work and pair really well. I'm also going to do just a little bit of chives. This is also in the onion family, but I like the color that it adds. I'm just going to do a few sprigs.
Kole, do you rinse the capers before you add them?
I don't. You can if you want to, but again, I really like the salty brininess that they naturally have. So I think it's fine if you don't. So I'm just getting some really, or aiming for a fine dice here. Because chives are a little bit finicky, sometimes you don't always get the most uniform cut, and that's okay. I don't think anyone will judge you for it. Cool. Happy with that. That goes in. Let's see if I'm missing anything on here. There's lots of ingredients. I think we did everything. Cool. All right, so all we have to do is give this a mix. And you have a really citrusy and zesty remoulade sauce. Oh my gosh, this looks great. I really wish there was smell-o-vision. Like whenever you go to zest something, those aromatics and those flavors are so pungent. My gosh, delicious. So if we were to plate this, shall we? We have, oh my gosh, this is like the best timing. We have 35 seconds left in the oven. Perfect. I'm just going to stop it now. All right. So let's go ahead and plate this. Got our crab cake with, oh my gosh, how fun. I'm really excited for lunch. Our crispy green beans, shift this off to the side, and our homemade remoulade sauce to dip everything in. It doesn't need to be this chunky if you don't want it, but I like it. I think it's fun. And voila, I'll show you on this camera here. So there you have it. Kole's take on a crab cake, crispy green bean fries, and a homemade, really warm and citrusy remoulade sauce. So that's our class today. Is there any more questions?
I don't see any more questions. If you have one, go ahead and put it in the chat. It looks fantastic. I'm ready to eat my lunch too now. It does not look like that. All right.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. I'm sorry for some of the technical difficulties on my end with the spam call and the vacuuming, but I appreciate your patience. And I mean, as you can see, this really is just, it's fairly simple. It doesn't take a ton of time. The ingredients list is kind of long, so I just wanted to be sure that everything was good on that end, but I hope you had fun and do give this a try. Again, crab is on sale right now at Safeway, not sponsored. It's just, I think if you really like crab, like I do, go ahead and give it a try. It's pretty easy, it's delicious, and it doesn't take a lot of time.
Thank you. Is there, I'm sorry, there was one more question. What kind of crab did you use?
Yep, I did Maryland Premium Lump Crab brand. I don't remember the brand, but there's a few selections that are on sale right now.
Great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, happy Saturday, everyone. Enjoy the weekend, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Kole.
Absolutely. Bye.